Mr. Corbyn has given a very interesting interview in the last, since yesterday, and since Kwasi has given us his new mini budget with such a maximum impact. Mr. Corbyn has described it as irresponsible. Well, of course, he may be irritated that it is the Conservatives and Kwasi who are being radical, who are being revolutionary. Normally it's the left which is being revolutionary. Indeed, Mr. Corbyn himself was at one point described as grossly irresponsible in the past, and with some justification. Anyway, I think there's 2 points that Corbyn is making. The first is that the tax break is being funded by excessive borrowing, and the second is that Mr. Kwasi is planning to pay the rich more using bankers' bonuses. It's the biggest tax cuts in 50 years. Kwasi is making headlines, and I suspect he's trying to scotch the headlines that he made earlier while fiddling during the Queen's funeral. But we go back to Mr. Corbyn, and the interview he's given is full of Republican yearnings. So my hunch is to try and squash and quash all of Corbyn's points and to destroy the foundation on which he's basing everything, but I find I can't. His Republican urge to question the singing of God Save the King at the coming Labour conference is pure Corbyn malice about rulers and fiddling in quite a different way to Kwasi's own trouser fumble. And actually, as far as Kwasi is concerned, he is following in a good example. I mean, think Matt Hancock and Gina, I've got some fiddling to do in the stationery cupboard, something out of place. Let's adjust the HB and reconfigure the rubbers and rulers. But there is serious content here. So Kwasi is managing 45 billion tax cuts, and that must be good in principle. He's reducing red tape in the process of these tax cuts, I hope. He's freeing up enterprise, encouraging investment and jobs in the UK, albeit only at the top. Now, there are problems, even if you approach this from a non-ideological point of view, particularly from a non-socialist point of view. Even if you approach it as a good Conservative, there are problems. So most of the people benefiting from the slashing of the top rate of tax will be men. So it's not a glass ceiling-centred budget at all. And more than that, the demands on part-time workers, which Kwasi also was keen to point out, is going to impact working mothers. So again, it's a bit clumsy. People who are working part-time, who are managing to juggle care and nursery bills, will be further penalised and threatened by this mini budget. It will add to the 2.4 million struggling with care needs, and it will not be helped by the huge bulk of childcare providers who have already stopped working partly because of COVID. So from that point of view, I don't see how even a good Conservative can defend this budget, particularly if they're looking at the value that it gives to women in the workplace. If the aim, on the other hand, is to bolster competitiveness and put Britain on the map, well, I can see some advantage in that in principle, but then why did the pound take such a tumble yesterday? So we have to wait to see if the pound recovers from that. It is quite true that the UK can afford to borrow. The UK's debt is lower than that of many of the other G7 nations. But if this budget was to simply favour the rich, Kwasi has achieved that. And I think if he is prepared to borrow, and prepared to increase our debt, then he should have also had thought for the poor. There's no thought at all for the poor in this budget except to penalise them. He might have borrowed a bit more and shared his largesse. That would be politics. This is ideology. If he thinks borrowing is okay, if he thinks borrowing is acceptable, he should have borrowed a bit more and been a little more generous. Instead, he has been radical and mean. And I think he has ensured, with this single act, he has ensured that that Labour wins the next election. Will this cause significant growth in the Brexit economy? Possibly. Will it ensure resentment and election failure in 2 years' time? Absolutely. This is a gamble that Kwasi could not afford to make, and I think he's going to be personally 100% responsible for the failure of the Conservative Party at the next election, and probably for keeping the Conservative Party out of office for the next decade, and possibly the destruction of the Conservative Party itself. That may be no bad thing, I don't know, but I think this budget has been irresponsible in the extreme. And I hope there were people around the cabinet table who stood up to Kwasi and made it clear that the principles of it, the details of it, come across as unfair. That's the simple matter. I could well understand tax breaks if they were paralleled by some sort of giving. I think he's got a small amount of time maybe to repair some of the damage. I think it's unlikely that's going to happen. This is a man who prefers to fiddle and giggle at important occasions, and that level of contempt he has for the Queen is, I think, matched by the contempt he has for the majority of the electorate. Terribly simple.